I watched a trader lose 37 trades in a row and walk away completely fine. Not pretending to be fine, actually fine. Calm, ready for trade 38. Meanwhile, another trader I knew lost 3 trades, just 3, and spiraled so hard he quit trading for 6 months. Same market, same basic strategy, completely opposite psychological outcomes. The difference wasn't skill or experience or mental toughness. It was one simple position sizing trick that the first trader understood at a level most traders never reach. He'd figured out how to size his positions so that losing literally could not hurt him. Not because the losses were tiny, but because he'd discovered the exact threshold where his brain stopped interpreting loss as threat. And once you find that threshold for yourself, disaster becomes mathematically impossible. Not improbable. Impossible. Let me explain what I mean by that because it sounds extreme. When I say disaster becomes impossible, I'm not talking about avoiding losses. Losses are inevitable. They're part of trading. What I'm talking about is avoiding the psychological disasters that destroy accounts. The revenge trading, the stop moving, the positions sizing up out of desperation, the emotional spirals that turn a normal losing streak into an account-ending catastrophe. And here's what you need to understand right from the start. You've probably blown up an account or come dangerously close, and you can't quite explain how it happened. You were managing risk, at least you thought you were. You weren't doing anything crazy. You were following the rules you'd learned. Risk 1%, maybe 2% per trade. Use proper stop losses. Don't overtrade. All the standard advice. But somehow things spiraled anyway. Maybe you started moving your stops just a little bit at first. Maybe you took a revenge trade after a loss. Maybe you just froze and couldn't execute your plan anymore. And the worst part, the part that's probably eating at you right now, is that you have no idea how to make absolutely sure it doesn't happen again. Because here's the truth. Every time you enter a trade, there's this underlying tension. You're worried about the loss. You're calculating in the back of your mind how much it will hurt if you're wrong. And that worry, that psychological weight, changes everything about how you trade. You can't think clearly. You hesitate on good setups. You hold bad trades too long hoping they'll come back. You make decisions based on fear instead of analysis. And the advice you've been given doesn't help because it's treating position sizing like it's purely mathematical. Risk X% of your account. Use this formula. Calculate your stop distance. Plug the numbers in. But that approach completely ignores the psychological reality, the truth that nobody talks about openly. The same dollar amount affects different traders completely differently. And even more important, the same dollar amount affects you differently depending on your emotional state. 1% of a $10,000 account is $100. For some traders, losing $100 is completely neutral. It doesn't trigger anything emotionally. It's just data. For other traders, losing $100 creates emotional interference that destroys their execution. They start second-guessing. They start protecting trades. They start making decisions designed to avoid pain instead of decisions designed to follow their plan. So the trick, the real trick that saves traders from disaster, isn't following a percentage rule. It's discovering your personal psychological threshold where loss becomes emotionally irrelevant, and then never, ever crossing it. This isn't about being conservative or aggressive. It's not about risking less to protect your account. It's about risking at a level that protects your psychology. Because when your psychology is protected, when you're trading below your emotional threshold, your account automatically becomes safer. You stop doing all the stupid things, the revenge trades, the stop moving, the desperate position adding, all the behaviors that actually cause disasters. And here's the emotional relief I want you to feel by the end of this. When you implement this trick properly, when you really get it and apply it, that constant background anxiety disappears. You'll enter trades without that sick feeling in your stomach. You'll handle losing streaks without spiraling into self-doubt or desperation. You'll finally understand what it feels like to trade from a place of psychological freedom where disasters simply cannot happen because you've removed the emotional conditions that create them. So let me tell you a story from my own trading, a period where I learned this lesson the hard way. I was running two accounts simultaneously. One was my serious account, my main account, with significant capital that I'd built up over years. The other was what I called my experimental account, much smaller, maybe 10% of the size of my main account. I used it to test new strategies, to try different approaches, to play around without risking my main capital. And I started noticing something really bizarre, something that didn't make logical sense. I was more profitable in the small account, consistently, month after month. My win rate was roughly the same in both accounts. I was using the same core strategy, the same technical approach, the same market analysis, but the results were different. In my small experimental account, my average winner was bigger and my average loser was smaller. The quality of my execution was objectively better. And at first, I thought this was just variance, random statistical noise. It would even out eventually, but it didn't. It persisted for months. And one day, I was sitting there reviewing my trading journal, going through all my trades from both accounts, and I saw the pattern clearly. It hit me like a punch to the stomach. In my small account, I was following my plan perfectly. Stop gets hit, I close the trade immediately. No questions, no negotiation. Winner starts running, I let it go according to my rules. I don't cut it early. I don't second guess. I just execute mechanically, exactly as I planned. In my big account, I was a complete mess. I'd move stops just a little bit, telling myself I was giving the trade more room to breathe. I'd close winners early because I was afraid of giving back profit. I'd skip good setups because I was scared of taking another loss after a bad day. I'd hesitate. I'd overthink. I'd make excuses. And none of this was conscious. I genuinely believed I was trading the same way in both accounts. I thought I was executing my plan consistently across the board, but I wasn't. And the difference was entirely psychological, driven completely by position sizing. In my small experimental account, losing a trade meant losing maybe $50 or $100. That amount was psychologically irrelevant to me. It didn't trigger fear. It didn't make me question my system or my ability. It was just data. Just one trade in a series of thousands. So I could execute perfectly. I could follow my rules without any emotional interference. In my big account, I was risking the same percentage. Let's say 1%. To keep the math simple. But 1% of a much larger account meant losing $500 or $800 per trade. And even though that was still proper risk management by all the conventional standards, even though every trading book would say that was fine, it had crossed my psychological threshold. Losing $800 mattered to me emotionally. It meant something. It triggered something in my nervous system that losing $100 didn't trigger. And that emotional significance, that psychological weight, made me do stupid things. I'd try to protect the trade by moving my stop because I couldn't handle the thought of losing $800. I'd cut winners early because I couldn't handle the thought of an $800 winner turning into a loss. I was optimizing for avoiding psychological pain instead of following my plan, and that's when I learned the trick. That's when everything changed for me. I reduced my position size in the big account significantly. Not because the math said I should. The math said I was completely fine risking 1%. The formula said I could even risk more if I wanted. But because the psychology said I wasn't fine. I cut my risk per trade in half, sometimes more than half. And immediately, like turning on a light switch, my execution improved. I was theoretically leaving money on the table. I was risking less than I could afford mathematically, but I became more profitable because I stopped sabotaging myself. I stopped moving stops. I stopped cutting winners early. I stopped hesitating on good setups because I'd found my psychological threshold and positioned myself below it. And below that threshold, I could execute perfectly. So the question you're probably asking right now is, how do you know what your psychological threshold is? How do you find that magic number where loss stops creating emotional interference? Because it's different for everyone. What's psychologically irrelevant to me might be significant to you. What's significant to you might be irrelevant to someone else. And here's what makes it even more complicated. Your threshold changes. It's not static. It moves based on your context, your emotional state, what's happening in your life, what's happening in your account. But before we get into how to find it and adjust it, I want to give you another way to think about this. Another story that might make this click at a deeper level. There's a reason airplane pilots use checklists even though they've done the same procedures thousands of times. Even though they know exactly what to do, even though they could probably do it in their sleep, they still pull out the checklist and go through it item by item. It's not because they don't know what to do. It's not because they're forgetful or incompetent. It's because in moments of stress, human brains do unpredictable things. We skip steps, we make assumptions, we override good procedures with emotional impulses. We think we're thinking clearly, but we're not. So aviation created a system where the checklist removes the opportunity for emotional interference. The pilot doesn't have to rely on feeling confident or calm or clear-headed. They just follow the list. And that systematic approach, that removal of emotion from critical decisions, has made flying one of the safest activities in the world. Now imagine a pilot who says, "I don't need the checklist today because I'm feeling really confident about this flight. I've done this route 100 times. I know what I'm doing. I'm experienced. I'm skilled. I don't need to waste time with the checklist." That pilot is introducing disaster risk that has absolutely nothing to do with their skill level. They might be the best pilot in the world technically, but by relying on their emotional state instead of their system, they've opened the door to the kind of errors that cause catastrophes. Most traders approach position sizing like that overconfident pilot. They calculate their position size based on how they feel about the trade. High conviction, bigger position. This setup looks absolutely perfect, bigger position. I need to make back yesterday's losses, bigger position. I'm feeling confident today, bigger position. But conviction and confidence are emotional states. They're not market realities. They have absolutely no correlation with whether a trade will actually work. The market doesn't care how confident you feel. Your conviction doesn't change the probability of the trade succeeding. And using your emotional state to determine position size is introducing disaster risk. That's completely unnecessary. You're setting yourself up for the exact same kind of emotional interference that causes pilots to skip steps and make fatal errors. The trick is creating a position sizing checklist that removes emotion from the equation entirely. Not a mathematical formula based on percentages, though the math matters, but a psychological checklist based on your emotional capacity. Before every trade, you ask one simple question. If this trade loses, will I be able to take the next trade without hesitation? Will I be able to execute my next valid setup immediately without emotional baggage? If the answer is anything other than an absolute yes, an immediate confident yes, the position is too big. It doesn't matter what the math says. It doesn't matter if you can afford it according to the formulas. If losing it will create emotional interference, if it will make you hesitate or second-guess or protect the next trade, you're setting up a disaster. And here's where it gets tricky. Here's where most traders struggle. Your emotional capacity isn't fixed. It's not a constant. It changes based on your account balance, based on your recent trades, based on what's happening in your life outside of trading, based on how much sleep you got, based on whether you're stressed about other things. So the trick isn't just finding one perfect position size and using it forever. The trick is learning to constantly adjust based on your psychological state. And that requires a level of self-awareness that most traders never develop. Let me break down the core truth here. The psychological threshold I keep talking about is real. It's not some abstract concept. There is a specific dollar amount where your brain switches from "this is acceptable loss" to "this is a threat." And that threshold is different for every person. For some traders, that number might be $50. For others, it might be $5,000. And here's what's fascinating. It has nothing to do with your account size. I've seen traders with $100,000 accounts get emotionally compromised by $100 losses. I've seen traders with $5,000 accounts stay completely calm through $500 losses. Why does the threshold exist? Why does your brain do this? Because your brain evolved to protect you from threats. That's its job. When you risk money that crosses your psychological threshold, your brain interprets that as a survival threat. It might not be an actual survival threat. You're not going to die from losing this money. But your brain doesn't know that. It just knows that this amount of loss matters, and it activates your stress response. And when survival instincts activate, when that fight or flight response kicks in, rational thinking shuts down. You stop being able to execute your plan. You start making decisions based on fear instead of analysis. That's when you start doing all the things that cause disasters. Moving stops, because you can't accept the loss. Revenge trading because you need to make it back. Sizing up your next position because you're desperate. Freezing completely and not taking the next trade because you're scared. All of these behaviors come from your brain trying to protect you from what it perceives as a threat. And here's the critical insight that changes everything. You can use perfect risk management math and still be emotionally compromised if you're risking above your threshold. The math might say you can afford to lose 2% of your account. The formulas might say that's completely reasonable and safe. But if 2% equals an amount that your brain interprets as threatening, you're going to make emotional decisions. You're going to sabotage yourself in ways you don't even consciously recognize. You'll think you're following your plan, but you'll be making tiny adjustments, tiny compromises that compound into disasters. So here's the trick in its simplest form. Find your threshold by working backwards from emotional response. Start with position sizes that feel almost ridiculously small. Sizes where losing genuinely doesn't matter to you at all, where you could lose 10 trades in a row and still feel completely neutral about it. Then slowly, carefully increase your position size until you notice even the slightest emotional interference. Hesitation before entering, worry while you're in the trade, relief when you close it, tension in your body. That's your threshold. That's the line, and you never cross it. And here's the paradox that messes with everyone's head. Trading below your psychological threshold usually makes you more profitable, not less. You'd think risking less would mean earning less. That's what the math suggests. But it doesn't work that way in practice. Because when you remove emotional interference, when you trade below your threshold, you execute better. You follow your plan without deviation. You don't sabotage yourself. You cut losses immediately. You let winners run. You take every valid setup without hesitation. And better execution with smaller positions beats terrible execution with larger positions every single time. It's not even close. Most traders never figure this out because their ego gets in the way. Their ego says, I should be able to handle bigger positions. I'm leaving money on the table. I'm trading scared. I'm being too conservative. Other traders risk more than this. I need to be braver. But that's ego talking, not logic. The most sophisticated risk management isn't about demonstrating courage. It's about protecting your psychology so you can execute perfectly over thousands of trades. Now let me explain why disasters happen and how this trick prevents them. Because most traders think disasters are caused by one huge catastrophic loss. They're not. They're almost never caused by one big loss. Disasters are caused by a series of small, emotional compromises that compound on each other. Let me walk you through the typical disaster sequence so you can recognize it. Trade 1 loses. And it was sized just slightly above your psychological threshold, so you feel it emotionally. It bothers you a little bit. Not enough to panic, but enough to matter. Trade 2, you're trying to make back trade 1, so you size up just a bit. Maybe you tell yourself it's because you have high conviction on this setup, but really, emotionally, you're trying to recover, and it loses too. Now you're definitely feeling it. Now you're emotional. Trade 3, you're desperate. So you either size up even more, trying to make it all back in one trade, or you skip it entirely because you're too scared to take another loss. Either way, you're not executing your plan anymore. You're in emotional reaction mode. This continues. Each trade makes the emotional state worse. Each decision is more compromised than the last. And before you know it, you've either blown up a significant portion of your account or you've completely paralyzed yourself and can't trade at all. And traders think, I just need more discipline. I need to control my emotions better. I need to be tougher mentally. But that's not the problem. That's not where the disaster started. The disaster started with trade 1 being sized above your threshold. Everything that followed was inevitable once that happened. Once you crossed your psychological threshold, once you introduced emotional significance to the loss, the cascade was basically automatic. But when your position size is below your psychological threshold, the disaster sequence can't start. Trade 1 loses, you don't feel it emotionally. It's neutral. You take trade 2 at the exact same size without any emotional baggage. It loses too, still neutral. You can execute through a 10-trade losing streak, even a 20-trade losing streak, without emotional interference because you never crossed the threshold. Think of your psychological threshold as a circuit breaker in your house. As long as you stay below it, the electricity flows normally. Everything works fine. Cross it and the whole system shuts down. Everything stops working properly. The disaster-proof approach is to permanently set your position size below that circuit breaker level. Not at the circuit breaker level, not dancing right on the edge of it, comfortably below it with margin for error. And here's what's hard about this. Here's why most traders resist it. Your ego hates it. Your ego says, this is weak, this is scared, this is leaving money on the table. Real traders risk more than this. Successful traders are aggressive and bold. But that's not true. That's ego distortion. The most successful traders I've ever met, the ones who've been profitable for decades, almost all of them risk less than you'd expect. Way less. They've learned through painful experience that protecting psychology is more important than maximizing theoretical returns. They'd rather make less money with perfect execution than try to make more money while sabotaging themselves with emotional interference. Now let me talk about the dynamic adjustment principle because this is crucial. Your psychological threshold isn't static. It moves. And learning to adjust your position size dynamically based on your current threshold is a huge part of this trick. When does your threshold drop? When does your emotional capacity for risk decrease? After a losing streak. After a stressful day at work. When your account is down significantly from its high point. When you're tired. When you're sick. When you're emotionally drained from something happening in your life outside of trading. All of these things lower your threshold. They reduce your emotional capacity. And most traders completely ignore this. They keep risking the same amount regardless of their psychological state. That's when disasters happen. You're trading with your normal position size, but your emotional capacity has dropped, so you're now trading above your threshold without even realizing it. You've crossed the circuit breaker and you don't know it until the system shuts down. On the flip side, when does your threshold rise? After a winning streak, you have more emotional capacity. When your account is at all-time highs, when you're well-rested and emotionally stable, when things are going well in your life, your threshold is higher during these times. But here's the trap. When your threshold is higher, when you're feeling good, your ego wants to risk more. It wants to capitalize on the confidence. It wants to size up and really make some money. And that's often when you set yourself up for the next disaster. Because the winning streak ends. They always do. And suddenly you're taking losses at inflated position sizes, and your threshold drops fast, and now you're way above it. So the trick, the way to actually implement this for long-term protection, is asymmetric adjustment. Always adjust your position size down when your psychological state is compromised. Never adjust it up just because you're feeling confident. Have a default position size that's comfortably below your normal threshold. When you're stressed, tired, on a losing streak, or emotionally compromised in any way, cut it in half. When you're feeling great, on a winning streak, emotionally stable, keep it at default. Don't increase it. This asymmetric approach protects you during vulnerable periods without exposing you during confident periods. And over time, it makes disasters mathematically impossible. Let me give you some practical steps you can implement immediately. Starting tomorrow. Starting with your next trade. First, the threshold discovery exercise. Tonight, before you go to sleep, I want you to do this. Imagine losing your next trade. Really visualize it. The trade goes against you. Your stop gets hit. You close it at a loss. Now ask yourself, what dollar amount can I lose without thinking about it after I close my laptop? What amount would let me sleep normally tonight without my mind spinning? Write that number down. That's your upper boundary for disaster-proof position sizing. That's the absolute maximum you should ever risk. And honestly, you should probably risk less than that number to give yourself margin. Second, the instant execute test. Tomorrow, before you take a trade, before you click the button, ask yourself this question. If this trade loses, can I immediately take the next valid setup without hesitation, without needing to see how this one goes first, without waiting to feel better? If there is any hesitation, well, let me see how this one plays out, any emotional reservation, the position is too big. Cut it in half and ask the question again. Keep cutting until the answer is an immediate yes. Third, the 3-day experiment. For the next 3 trading days, cut your normal position size in half. Just do it. Don't argue with it. Don't negotiate. Cut it in half and see what happens to your execution quality, your emotional state, your decision-making. Most traders will notice something remarkable. They follow their plan better. They cut losses faster. They let winners run longer. They take setups they would have skipped. Their execution quality goes up even though their position size went down. And that's the proof. That's the evidence that you were trading above your threshold before. Now let me give you a position sizing checklist. 3 questions to ask before every single trade. Question 1. On a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed am I today? Not about trading specifically, just in general. How's my emotional state? If you're above a 5, if you're feeling stressed or anxious or emotionally drained, cut your default position size in half. No exceptions. Question 2. If this trade loses, will my next decision be based on this loss? Will I be trying to make it back? Will I be scared to take the next trade? Will I be emotionally compromised in any way? If the answer is yes, or even maybe, the position is too big. Question 3. Am I sizing this position to prove something or to execute properly? Am I trying to demonstrate courage? Am I trying to show myself or someone else that I'm not scared? Am I trying to make back yesterday's loss? Or am I purely focused on executing my plan as well as possible? If you're sizing to prove something, you're setting up a disaster. size to execute properly, and nothing else. And here's an emergency protocol, a rule that will save you from disasters if you follow it religiously. If you lose 3 trades in a row at your current position size, immediately cut your size in half for the next 10 trades minimum. No exceptions, no negotiation. 3 losses in a row means something is off. Maybe your analysis is off. Maybe your emotional state is off. Maybe it's just variance. Doesn't matter. Cut your size in half and give yourself space to figure it out without bleeding the account. This prevents the disaster sequence from starting. It stops the emotional compounding before it can spiral. Finally, do a monthly reset. At the end of each month, review all your trades. Find the losses that emotionally bothered you, the ones you thought about after you closed them, the ones that affected your next trade. Those losses show you where your threshold is. Next month, size every single trade so that your biggest potential loss is below that level. Adjust your position sizing system based on real emotional data from your actual trading, not based on what you think you should be able to handle. Let me bring all of this together now and show you the complete picture. We started with a story. 2 traders, one lost 37 trades in a row and was fine. The other lost 3 trades and quit for 6 months. The difference was position sizing relative to psychological threshold. I shared my own story of the 2 accounts, how I was more profitable in my smaller account, not because of better strategy or analysis, but purely because the position sizes were below my emotional threshold. That's when I learned that position sizing is a psychology problem disguised as a math problem. Then I gave you the pilot's checklist metaphor. Just like pilots use checklists to remove emotional interference from critical procedures, you need a position sizing system that removes emotion from your risk decisions. We broke down the core lessons. The psychological threshold is real. There's a specific dollar amount where your brain switches from acceptable loss to threat. Find that threshold and never cross it. Disasters come from compounding bad decisions that start when you cross your threshold. Stay below it, and the disaster sequence cannot begin. It's mathematically impossible. Your threshold changes based on your emotional state. The trick is dynamically adjusting down when you're vulnerable, never adjusting up just because you feel confident. Asymmetric adjustment protects you, and I gave you practical tools. The threshold discovery exercise, the instant execute test, the 3-day experiment, the position sizing checklist, the emergency protocol, the monthly reset. Everything you need to implement this starting tomorrow. Now I need you to hear this truth clearly. You don't need to risk more to make more. You need to risk at a level that protects your psychology, because protected psychology creates perfect execution, and perfect execution creates profit. The disasters you've experienced, the account drawdowns, the emotional spirals, the periods where you couldn't trade properly, those weren't caused by bad luck or bad strategy. They were caused by position sizes that compromised your emotional state. But now you know the trick. Size below your threshold. Adjust down when vulnerable. Protect your psychology above everything else. Do this and disaster becomes impossible. Not improbable, impossible. The traders who never blow up, the ones who trade for decades without catastrophic drawdowns, they're not the ones with the most courage or the highest risk tolerance. They're the ones who found their psychological threshold and permanently stay below it. They've learned that the most important position sizing question isn't how much can I risk according to the formulas. It's how much can I risk without creating emotional interference. How much can I lose without it affecting my next decision? And when you get this right, when you truly implement this trick, trading transforms completely. The constant anxiety that you feel right now, that background tension every time you enter a trade, it disappears. You can execute through losing streaks without spiraling into self-doubt or desperation. You stop making the desperate decisions that cause disasters. You finally experience what it feels like to trade from a place of psychological safety, where you can follow your plan perfectly because nothing emotional is interfering, where losses are just data, not threats, where you can be wrong 10 times in a row and still execute trade 11 without hesitation. That's the freedom this trick gives you, and it's available to you right now. You don't need to wait. You don't need to learn anything else. You just need to implement what I've shared with you today. If this video gave you that moment of recognition, that sudden clarity of, oh, this is why I keep having disasters that shouldn't happen, this is why my execution falls apart under pressure, I need you to do something like this video. Not for me, for the algorithm that will show it to other traders who are risking above their psychological threshold right now and wondering why they keep self-destructing. They need to hear this. They deserve to understand what they're actually fighting against. Leave a comment with one number, your psychological threshold in dollars, the amount you can lose without emotional interference, the amount where you can take the next trade immediately without hesitation. I want you to claim it publicly, write it down, make it real, make it a commitment, and subscribe to this channel if you're ready to learn more about the psychological side of trading that actually determines success. Because we're going deeper. We're exploring more of how your mind works in the market and how to protect yourself from the invisible patterns that cause failure. This isn't about indicators or strategies or market analysis. This is about the psychology that determines whether you can execute what you know. And that's everything. Remember this. Position sizing isn't about courage. It's not about aggression or conviction or proving how confident you are. It's about creating the psychological conditions where you can execute perfectly. And perfect execution over thousands of trades is the only thing that makes money consistently. The disasters are optional. They're not inevitable. They're not just part of trading. They're the result of specific psychological conditions that you create with your position sizing decisions. And now you have the trick. You know how to make disasters impossible. The rest is just implementation, just doing it, just following through. The choice is yours, but everything you need is right here.